Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Sinking of the Blücher, the Battle of Drøbak Narrows, April 1940, by Geirr Haarr and Torbjørn Meilien, narrated by Ulf Bjorklund. Introduction. In the darkness of a bitterly cold night in April 1940, the German war machine descended upon Norway. Hitler had made a strategic decision that would change the course of World War II, 1 month before his long-planned attack on the Western Front. It was a daring action that required absolute surprise on all levels over a large geographical area. This is an account of what happened in Oslofjord on the night of 9 April and in the days that followed. The German heavy cruiser Blücher was sunk on its way to the Norwegian capital, and just about everything in that part of the operation went wrong for the German invaders. The book recounts why Blücher was there in the first place, why she was sunk, and what the disaster led to. As far as possible, the narrative is based on primary sources. Hours have been spent at various archives and collections, and tens of thousands of document pages have been scrutinized and compared. Published books, accounts, and memoirs have only been used as sources after a thorough assessment of their reliability. The research material has come in many languages: Norwegian, German, English, Swedish, and Danish. All translations into English are our own responsibility, and where necessary, we have striven to maintain the significance of what was said or written, rather than create a word-by-word translation. All Blücher's war diaries, logs, signal books, and official papers were lost when the ship went down. Most of the accounts of what happened on board are therefore based on memories or compilations rewritten after the survivors had been taken care of and gathered in Oslo or later. There were no German plans whatsoever for an attack on Scandinavia in September 1939. The rationale for Hitler to unleash his dogs of war on Norway and Denmark 7 months later developed during the winter through a series of intertwined, concurrent incidents and processes involving a German fear of being outflanked, Norwegian neutrality policy, Allied aspirations to sever Germany's iron ore supply, and their wish to establish an alternative front in Scandinavia, using the opportunity of the Soviet attack on Finland. The almost uniform inability to see and understand the warning signals, which were abundantly available, is one of the great enigmas of Operation Weserübung, as Germany's attack on Denmark and Norway was codenamed. Dissemination and analysis of intelligence was in its infancy in 1940, in particular in Scandinavia, and there was an intriguing inability to compile and understand what was about to happen. Not only were the signals overlooked in Oslo, they were equally neglected in London, Paris, and Copenhagen. As shown in this account, Blücher's demise was attributable to arrogance, unfortunate planning, and poor judgment. Her sinking was to have dramatic long-term effects on the development of the war. First of all, it opened a breach between the German Army and Navy over command of joint operations that would plague the German High Command for a long time. In addition, the outcome of the invasion and unexpected ensuing campaign affected Germany's ability to take the war to Britain later in 1940. Our objective has been to document the events in Oslofjord in April 1940 and their consequences, giving a balanced and factual account, a readable narrative without compromising the demand for research and accurate detail. Many people have helped us and contributed to our work, but responsibility for the interpretation of what happened and why and how this is conveyed is nevertheless ours and ours alone. Conventions followed. Place names are given in the local spelling used in 1940, thus Svinemünde, for example, rather than its modern Polish name of Świnoujście, except for a few places like Gothenburg or Copenhagen, where there is an accepted English language name. Titles and ranks are given in the original language. The 3 Norwegian letters E, Ö, and O are used as in the original language. In the text, Norwegian ranks are written without an initial capital, except when starting a sentence, as is the custom in Norwegian writing. In Germany, Great Britain was generally known as England in 1939-1940, like the Soviet Union was known as Russia. Hence, in translation of German text to English, we have used England where it appears, in order to maintain the flavor of the German expression. German time in April 1940 was 1 hour ahead of Norwegian and British time. Hence, midnight German time was 2300 Norwegian time. Unless noted, all times after Group 5 pass into Norwegian waters are Norwegian time, NOT, and thus 1 hour behind German time, GET. Chapter 1. The Ship. The Kriegsmarine. On 30 January 1933, Adolf Hitler took office as Chancellor of a right-wing coalition government in Berlin. The CNC of the German Navy, Admiral Erich Raeder, met his new head of government for the first time on 2 February when Hitler addressed the senior officers during a dinner. In a subsequent private meeting some weeks later, Raeder was assured he would have time to rebuild the Navy before any war erupted. The two appeared to have struck a friendly note at first, and the Führer was willing to listen to the Admiral and accept his advice in naval matters. Arguably not a hardened National Socialist, unlike many colleagues in the senior officer corps, Raeder nevertheless used the powers of the Nazi regime to the utmost for his navy, realizing that he could not have one without the other. Most probably he believed, or at least hoped, that the sharp edges of the new regime would wear off with time. In August 1934, the elderly head of state, President Hindenburg, died, and Hitler declared himself president, in addition to chancellor, combining the two offices of state with full dictatorial powers. A few days later, all officers of the armed forces were paraded and ordered to pledge an oath of allegiance to Hitler in person. In a speech on Heroes' Memorial Day, 16 March 1935, Hitler repudiated the Versailles Treaty and declared that Germany would resume its full sovereign powers. Compulsory conscription and military service for all young men was reintroduced, and the resurrection of the German armed forces commenced. 2 months later, the Navy was ominously renamed the Kriegsmarine, and the German shipyards started to plan for full production. On 27 January 1938, Hitler issued a decree declaring himself Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces. The authority would be exercised through a new joint high command, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, that oversaw the separate high commands of the country's armed services. OKW was in effect to be Hitler's personal staff, combining strategic, operational, and ministerial functions. Generaloberst Wilhelm Keitel was head of OKW, with Generalmajor Alfred Jodl as his deputy and leader of the operations staff, Führungsstab. In April 1939, Raeder was promoted to Großadmiral, Grand Admiral, but it appears that he, and thus the Kriegsmarine, increasingly lost touch with Nazi reality during this period. The Navy was gradually excluded from the inner circles of the Third Reich, and Raeder would only be invited to meetings that had naval affairs on the agenda. The headquarters of the Navy High Command, Oberkommando der Marine, OKM, including Raeder, had its offices at Tirpitzufer in Berlin, next to the Landwehr Canal. The Naval Warfare Command, Seekriegsleitung, SKL, responsible for planning and execution of naval operations, as well as intelligence, administration, and construction, was directly subordinated to OKM. The Chief of Staff of the SKL, Konteradmiral Otto Schneewind, a reserved analytical and meticulous officer, was Raeder's right-hand man. Under the SKL, Naval Group Command West, Marinengruppenkommando West, with its headquarters at Sengwarden near Wilhelmshaven, under the command of Generaladmiral Alfred Saalwächter, oversaw operations in the Heligoland Bight, the North Sea, and the Norwegian Sea, while Naval Group Command East, Marinengruppe Kommando Ost, under Admiral Rolf Karls, covered the Baltic from headquarters in Kiel. The Naval Group Commands had on paper operational control within their areas of command, but OKM and SKL would routinely intervene, either directly or through strict detailed orders. Flottenchef, or CNC Fleet, was Generaladmiral Hermann Böhm, with headquarters in Kiel. During major operations, the Flottenchef was usually at sea as task force commander on board one of the capital ships. Shortly after the outbreak of war in 1939, Böhm fell out with Saalwächter and was replaced by Admiral Wilhelm Marschall. At the same time, the command of the Flottenchef was limited to the capital ships, and separate commands established for cruisers, destroyers, torpedo boats, and other functional groups of ships. The submarine headquarters, under Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, BDU, Konteradmiral Karl Dönitz, also at Sengwarden in early 1940, had significant operational freedom. Most minesweepers and patrol boats were under harbor security command at this stage. The new ships needed crews, and a large-scale recruitment campaign was initiated, while many petty officers and warrant officers were promoted, and some commissioned, preparing for expansion. This was good for them, but awkward for the Kriegsmarine, which lost the backbone of its organization and had to train new petty officers amidst increased competition for the best candidates from the other services. As war drew close, a large number of auxiliaries and support ships were requisitioned, and the lack of experienced officers became even worse. Loopholes. The Treaty of Versailles reduced Germany's military forces to a minimum after World War I. The Navy was reduced to 8 outdated pre-dreadnought battleships, a similar number of old cruisers, and about 50 destroyers, torpedo boats, minesweepers, and other smaller vessels. No U-boats were allowed. The program for new builds was strictly limited, and only in 1927 did the light cruiser Emden enter service as the first new ship in a decade. She was robust and functional, but a top speed of 29.5 knots and single 15-centimeter guns and shielded mountings made her obsolete almost from the day of her launch. The design office announced her as displacing 5,400 tons, some 600 tons less than allowed, using all possible loopholes, including the ambiguity between tons and long tons, to the full. In fact, her standard displacement exceeded 6,950 tons, well over the limit. The Allied Control Commission failed to condemn this, and, once played successfully, these tricks were exploited in all future designs until limits were altogether ignored. Designing an efficient capital ship with no more than 28-centimeter guns within the 10,000-ton displacement limit created even bigger challenges. The first, Deutschland, was not only the first German ship to carry triple turrets and aircraft catapults, she was also the first capital ship in any navy with solely diesel propulsion, 4 engines per shaft. It was intended she should outgun all faster ships and outrun any with larger guns, but a maximum speed of only 28 knots would make the latter somewhat of a challenge, even if few Allied capital ships in commission at the time could catch her. Launched in May 1931, Deutschland was initially classified by the Kriegsmarine as a Panzerschiff, or armored ship. Officially within the 10,000-ton limit, she was nonetheless close to 15,000 tons when loaded. The British Admiralty looked at her with some concern, but though fast, she and her 2 sisters were not fast enough, and with unreliable engines and poor performance in heavy seas, they never achieved what was expected of them. Up to 7 additional similar ships were planned, but only Admiral Geirr and Admiral Graf Spee were completed. Proper capital ships were needed, and the engineers of the design office were sent back to the drawing board. Redesign took time, and only in May and June of 1935 were the keels of the battleships Gneisenau and Scharnhorst laid down. Bismarck and Tirpitz would follow, but not be operational until 1941 and 1942 respectively, by which time their value was doubtful. The making of a destroyer force was started with the 6 ships of the Raubvogel class. The first, Möwe, was launched in March 1926. Armed with 3 10.5-centimeter guns, 6 torpedo tubes, and capable of a fair 34 knots, they were primarily designed for torpedo attacks, but also equipped for mine-laying and coastal escort duties. 6 subsequent ships of the slightly larger and faster Raubtier class were commissioned between October 1928 and August 1929. All these vessels were later reclassified as torpedo boats, Torpedoboote. True destroyers would not be available for several years. For the Kriegsmarine, the war with Britain came several years too early. Raeder had to revise all his plans and accept that resources would have to be spent on building far more U-boats than he had foreseen. The Kriegsmarine could not sustain another humiliating and passive existence as in the previous war. He could not leave the fighting to the Army and Luftwaffe, the new Air Force. The Royal Navy had been neglected during the 1930s, but remained a major challenge, and it would be crucial to find ways of operating with the ships at hand, while making those in the pipeline ready for war. If the British gained the upper hand, the German surface fleet would be degraded to small ships and submarines. On the eve of World War II, the Kriegsmarine had in commission 2 battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, 2 old battleships, Schlesien and Schleswig-Holstein, 3 Panzerschiffe, Admiral Graf Spee, Admiral Geirr, and Deutschland, 1 heavy cruiser, Admiral Hipper, 6 light cruisers, Emden, Leipzig, Nuremberg, Köln, Karlsruhe, and Königsberg, 34 destroyers and large torpedo boats, 57 U-boats, and some 40 other small vessels. Within weeks, virtually all building of large surface ships, except those near completion, was suspended to focus on U-boats and smaller vessels. In the end, Bismarck, Tirpitz, Blücher, and Prinz Eugen were the only ships larger than destroyers to be commissioned by the Kriegsmarine after the outbreak of the war. Germany's first aircraft carrier, Graf Zeppelin, was launched in late 1938, but work was suspended in 1940, and she ended up as a useless hulk. Heavy cruisers. Most of the German naval staff considered cruisers essential in the Baltic, as well as the North Sea and the Atlantic, and vital resources were spent designing and building such ships. The light cruisers Karlsruhe, Königsberg, and Köln, commissioned between February 1929 and January 1930, displaced 6,650 tons standard, an undeniable breach of the Versailles Treaty, followed by a further 2 with modified designs. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 18 June 1935 limited the German Navy to 35% of the British strength prescribed by the treaties. This prevented the construction of additional armored cruisers, but allowed for 5 modern heavy cruisers. Orders for the first 2, Blücher and Admiral Hipper, were placed in secrecy by the Kriegsmarine in October 1934 at Deutsche Werke in Kiel and Blum and Voss in Hamburg, respectively. In parallel, a development and construction contract was awarded to the Krupp Company for 20.3 centimeter, 8-inch main guns and turrets, which was the largest caliber allowed on cruisers according to the Washington Treaty. Following the design specifications of the treaty, Admiral Hipper was officially 10,000 tons when taken into service. In reality, she had a displacement of 14,247 tons standard and 18,208 tons full load. Blücher a few hundred tons more. Admiral Hipper was commissioned in April 1939. As was the case for most large German ships, the forecastle was found to be very wet, even in moderate seas. During a refit in late 1939, a raked Atlantic clipper bow was fitted, the bridge improved, and a funnel cap added to prevent smoke invading the bridge platforms. This made her a very handsome, efficient-looking ship, and very difficult to distinguish from the battleships at a distance, a problem the Royal Navy and RAF Coastal Command would face several times. These modifications were fitted to Blücher before she was commissioned on 20 September 1939. When released from the yard in Kiel on 30 March 1940, Blücher displaced 14,224 tons standard and 18,694 tons fully loaded. She was 195 meters, 640 feet, long at the waterline, and with the clipper bow, her overall length was 205.9 meters, 676 feet. She was designed primarily for surface warfare, but also had some anti-aircraft, anti-submarine, mine warfare, and signals intelligence capabilities. Blücher's main armament for surface warfare comprised 8 20.3 centimeter C-34 guns in twin turrets, Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, from bow to stern in German terminology. All guns were provided with high explosive, armor-piercing, and semi-armor-piercing, HE, AP, SAP rounds, and the magazines for B and C turrets also had star shells. The 122-kilo shells were fired using a two-part propellant charge, rate of fire being 4 rounds per gun per minute, with an effective range of 25,000 meters. The turrets revolved electrically as part of the electro-hydraulic system. Otherwise, turrets, hoists, breeches, and loaders were operated hydraulically. Turret Anton had restrictions on firing directly ahead at low elevations for ranges less than 5,000 meters due to the raised forecastle. Blücher's secondary armament consisted of 12 10.5-centimeter C-33 multi-purpose guns and 6 stabilized twin mountings produced by Rheinmetall. These guns had a maximum range of 17,000 meters, with an effective range of 12,000 meters, using 26.5-kilo fixed ammunition with a shell weight of 15.1 kilo. The firing rate per gun was 15 to 18 rounds per minute. Both types of guns were efficient and robust, although the 10.5-centimeter mounts had some electrical problems due to insufficient attention to water tightness. Usually, bearing and elevation for the 20.3-centimeter and 10.5-centimeter guns were received from one of the centralized gyro-stabilized fire control directors, or from the centrally controlled data and firing system connected to the calculators. The director was connected to an order transmission unit and a fire control transmitter, passing information to one of the 2 fire control centers, fore and aft. Both centers used a position-keeping calculator and a ballistic calculator deep in the ship. Any director could provide data to the guns of the main or secondary armament, as well as the torpedoes. In an emergency, the guns could be aimed directly at the target by the trainer at the telescopic sights. B and C turrets had their own rangefinders, but the rest of the guns depended on central rangefinders, or as the last resorts, assessments done by the gun commander supported by telescopic sights or binoculars. There were 4 7-meter horizontal stereoscopic rangefinders, 1 on the foretop tower, 1 at the aft fire control, and 1 each on B and C turrets. In addition, 1 6-meter rangefinder was in the forward fire control center. Switching between directors, calculators, and local control was unproblematic. Each fire control could take over from any of the others should they fall out. It was also possible to divide the 20.3-centimeter battery to engage 2 targets simultaneously using different directors. Entering combat, the captain would use a target finder, Zielsäule, literally a target column or aiming post on the open bridge, to point out its chosen target to the gunnery officers. The main weapons would be directed by one of the gunnery officers. The first gunnery officer, first Artillerieoffizier, or first AO, was usually in the forward fire control in the foretop, or Vormarschstand, above the bridge. The navigation bridge, the wheelhouse, and the forward fire control center were co-located in front of the tower above the B turret. Both navigation and combat management took place from the vessel's bridge, either from the open part or from inside the armored citadel. The admiral's bridge was in the middle of the forward tower, but had no instruments for navigation or fire control. The 4th gunnery officer, 4th AO, was in the forward fire control center behind the navigation bridge. Outside, between the tower and the fire control center, there were on both sides of the ship directors for guns, star shells, searchlights, and torpedoes. The 3rd gunnery officer, 3rd AO, usually had his station in the aft fire control center behind C turret with similar directors as forward. Each gunnery officer handled a Zielgeber fire control director assisted by 2 men. Their preferred method was usually salvo firing, and to hit the target, a ladder was first fired, 3 salvos spaced 400 meters apart, or alternatively ranging shots, bracketing. Rapid salvos were then ordered when the target was straddled or hit. The 10.5-centimeter guns were also part of the anti-aircraft system, AA, controlled by the 2nd gunnery officer. 2nd AO had his normal position in the anti-aircraft control center in the tower, with 2 gun target columns. The forward AA directors for the 10.5-centimeter guns were designated A, starboard, and B, port. The after directors, C, starboard, and D, port. Starboard 10.5 centimeter mounts were known as STB-1, STB-2, and STB-3, and similarly on the port side. The light anti-aircraft armament included 12 twin-mounted 3.7 centimeter guns and 8 single 2 centimeter guns, better than many contemporary ships. The 3.7 centimeter gun was semi-automatic, with a rate of fire of up to 80 rounds per barrel per minute. The novel gyro stabilization was effective, though not perfect. The 2 centimeter gun was fully automatic, but manually trained and elevated with hand wheels. It had a theoretical rate of fire of 280 rounds per minute. In practice, though, it fired at around 180 RPMs due to an inadequate magazine design. The 10.5 centimeter guns had a rather low rate of fire, but supplemented by 3.7 centimeter and 2 centimeter guns, they gave the cruiser a potent anti-aircraft defense. Blücher was equipped with a Funkmessachtung radar, FUMO-22, which was a well-kept secret. The 2 6-meter mattress aerials of the FUMO-22 set were mounted on the rangefinder cupola above the Vormarschstand and could not rotate independently of the cupola. Radar was in its infancy when Blücher was built, and the type on board could only track one object at a time. Its main use was ranging of targets detected visually. Accuracy was poor, and it did not work properly near a coastline or in fjords. Blind firing by radar was not possible. Up to 3 Arado AR-196 float planes could be carried for scouting, reconnaissance, and spotting for the artillery. The crew consisted of a pilot and a navigator/gunner. Each aircraft could carry 2 50-kilo bombs. There were 2 separate hydrophone systems on board for passive underwater listening, in addition to an active S-Geräte sonar. This was not as effective as the comparable British system known as ASDIC. 12 torpedo tubes completed the offensive surface armament, in 2 triple mounts on each side. The torpedoes could be aimed and fired from 2 torpedo directors in the forward fire control center, or secondary directors further aft. Each G7A torpedo had a warhead of 280 kilo of TNT. At 40 knots, the range was 7,500 meters. 4 to 6 depth charges on the quarterdeck could be fired electronically. Mines and tracks for mine-laying equipment could be carried, but were normally kept ashore. Paravanes aboard were for self-protection use in areas threatened by mines. Signals warfare and intelligence was restricted in 1940. Very high-frequency VHF, ultrakurzwelle, UKW, radio-telephone communication between ships had become an integral part of the Kriegsmarine's battle management. This was normally excellent, as it had a very short range and could be used between ships at sea, without being intercepted or used for direction finding by the enemy. Blücher was well equipped with electronic equipment and had 4 radio rooms. Radio Room A housed personnel of the cryptoanalysis and monitoring service, known as the Beobachtungsdienst, or B-Dienst. Most large ships had B-Dienst units on board, which in addition to encoding and decoding own messages, were expert in reading enemy signals, monitoring broadcasts, jamming, and sending of fake signals. Blücher's hull was constructed of longitudinal steel frames with an inner and an outer part. There were numerous frames and bulkheads, as well as an armored intermediate deck along the entire length of the ship, reinforcing the structure. A double bottom extended over 72% of the keel. The inner hull was separated into 14 watertight sections by transverse bulkheads or hull frames. These Abteilungen were numbered with Roman numerals from stern to bow. Thus ABT-1 was at the aftermost hull section, while ABT-9 and 10 were under the forward fire control center and bridge. Bulkheads, or Spanten, were numbered in Arabic numerals, also from stern to bow. The ship had 5 main decks, bottom to top: lower platform deck, upper platform deck, armored deck, battery deck, and the main deck with the superstructure and guns. On the main deck between turrets A and D, there were compartments for the sickbay, torpedo, and artillery maintenance, the aircraft hangar, galleys for seamen and officers, and the officers' mess. Accommodation for officers and seamen was located on the battery deck and the armored deck. The armored deck provided protection for the magazines and propulsion systems. The 80mm thick belt armor covering the sides of the ship had a height of 3.8 meters and went 1.7 meters below the waterline. The main turrets had...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?